And so, what is important about that story? It's how does she justify the difference? And the justification for invoking the law is other people have to be injured as well. That's the story we call before. So when they're telling that kind of a story, there's always a general good that's being achieved. But that was only one of the stories. In that story, the law is somewhere else. You have to go there. It takes time. Behavior is constrained by rules, but it's also enabled. You know, there are rules. Says the decision is here, the enforcement is someplace else. It's a bureaucratic system. It's the system, you know, the law tells about itself. It's the story. But there was a second story, which we call with the law. And this story that people told us was about being self-interested and being able to pursue your rights and always watching out for your interests. And in this story, people talked about lawyers. They talked about the craftiness of lawyers and how it makes a difference to have lawyers. And in this story, people justified the accessibility of the law. They justified its availability. They recognized that the haves come out ahead. Lawyers make a difference, but it's what the law is good for. If you need it, you can get it. And they really described it as a game, that some people can play better than others, and lawyers are the best at this game. And I'll give you an example of that. A young man living in a town in southern New Jersey, close to Philadelphia, who lives in his building, and he performs work as the superintendent in his building in exchange for a reduction in the rent. And all of us, unexpected, the landlord decides that he has to move, that he wants to rent the apartment to somebody else. And Raymond Johnson, we call him, tells the story, and he says, you know, I read that lease. I read that lease. He can't evict me. He can try to evict me. He could try to bring a suit, but it'll take him a long time, and I know that I can keep this going for a long time. It's not about whether it's right. It's just about whether I can win this. That's the second story. It's not about justice. It's about whether I can get what I need. But then there's a third story that people told us, and that third story is one we call against the law. But it isn't really against the law. We should have called it up against the law. It's when people experience themselves without alternatives. They recognize the first story, that law is a system of rules which can possibly give you just decisions, but they recognize that they don't have power. They don't have power, and they recognize that the first story isn't entirely real, and they don't have power to play with it like in the second story. And so when the opportunity arises, they find ways around the law. They don't engage in criminal behavior. That's not what we're describing. They find ways to get things done that aren't necessarily yet recognized by the law. And so what they do is they use social structure and they invert the rules. So if we recognize people's behavior is governed by roles, they alter the roles. So people pretend to be somebody they're not. Lots and lots of times people told us stories about pretending to be somebody. So a young girl who is under 18 but living by herself in her own apartment because her parents are abusive and alcoholic, she needs to go to the hospital. She goes to the first hospital, and when she fills out the form and they ask how old she is and she says 17, they say, well, we need your parents' signature. We can't let you into the hospital. She leaves the hospital, goes to another hospital, and when they ask how old she is, she says 19. Okay? Or a Hispanic painter that I ended up interviewing in Irvington, New Jersey, tells me that he's very upset about the vandalism by the teenagers, and whenever he calls the police, when he sees those kids doing something, the police don't come. He gets very annoyed. So finally, one night, he told me, he saw them spray painting. He called the police, and he said to me, and I made my voice like this and said, articulate the rules. They'll be more often literal than not. They'll hold people to the literal rules. And they get what they need. The lady I told you about, whose son had special education requirements but wanted to go to college, she sat in the office. She occupied the guidance counselor's office because that's the way she could get his attention. And she would, but what she said to me also, she said, I got all dressed up to look like those ladies who lived next door, so that she would have some authority and that she was a good mom. Okay, now these three stories, before, with, against the law, we call schemas or narrative. We claim that these are circulating in the culture. One person can tell all these stories. It's not that people are a before person and a with person or again. We're all these people. These are the common cultural tropes that circulate in American society about the law. This is the way the law lives in American society, as a set of disinterested judges, as a set of crafty lawyers, as a set of unresponsive police. I'm characterizing a little too heavily there. But this is the way people experience the law. And we think it very important that these schemas are in fact not entirely consistent, because they give space for people's diverse experiences, and yet they're all within the law. If we imagine the law, as early scholars seem to tell us, that it was all the before story, it's just disinterested decision making according to the rules, and process follows the rules. The minute you found a lawyer who didn't show up, or a judge who didn't read the papers, my God, the legal system would be no good. It was sort of like that first observation that the law in practice was not the same as the law on the books. But people know that sometimes the law doesn't work the way it says. And it makes a difference what kind of lawyer you have. And it's a good thing that it's accessible to pursue my self-interest, like Raymond Johnson says, because he's going to stay in that apartment because he's got a lease that says he can. And it's available for that. And one is a generalized ideal, and the other is sort of a pragmatic adaptation.
We're carpenter night. We're carpenter night.